So today I'm working on Lucas FW2 wiper motors. I needed 2 for my current Gypsy project, so I had 5 that were all non-functioning. They were in pretty tough shape. I tore them down and they all seem to have the same issues. There's a ton of grease in the gear side that over time, 50, 60 years, the grease solidifies and turns into a really thick, almost like putty. And that binds the gears up. Then on the motor side, some had gotten oil from the gear side inside them and onto the brushes and commutator. Some had water in them. Some had water come in through the shaft and seize up some of the shafts and gears inside. So they were in pretty tough shape, and the teardown video I did was mostly just a bunch of messy parts covered in grease. I have this one here that I took apart and cleaned already. So all the pieces are clean, so I can show you how it comes apart. When you go to remove the front half, you remove this front support here. There's a bushing in there that supports this shaft, and it's kind of an adapter to whatever type of vehicle it goes on. Then under here there's a spring with a washer and a snap ring. You take that snap ring out and the wiper arm shaft will come out the back. Then there's 3 nuts on here. You remove those, and the front cover comes off. Inside is where you're going to find the big messy pile of grease in there. So here you go. Here's that grease. Lots of it, and it's just like putty. So, you know, if your wiper motors are running slow, especially in the winter, because this stuff would really get stiff in the cold weather, and I have noticed that on my other old Gypsies. You know, so this is going to bind them up. But they put a lot of grease in here. It was just packed in here, all in these cavities, and it was so hard. Like you can see, there's still some residue left there that I haven't been able to get off. I washed them in my solvent tank, and then I actually soaked them in acetone to get them clean. And I did that after I took it apart. Of course, I didn't wash it before I took it apart. But this link comes off. This shaft with the lever comes off. This eccentric gear comes off. And these will be stuck in here. I had to work at these to get them out. Had to work to get that link off. This eccentric gear here, most of them either had solidified grease or rust on there. This little idler gear, it's sort of a fibrous plastic. You don't want to soak that in acetone for sure. So clean that just in some cleaning solvent. And that's your transmission side of the wiper motor assembly. Then you can flip it over, and there'll be 2 screws in here that you take out, and the back cover comes off. Looking inside here, there's a tab right there that comes in contact with this ground tab here. So when you flip the switch, it grounds that terminal and powers up the wiper motor. This side here is where your power supply comes from. There's a wire that runs up here and is soldered on here normally. So that's something that can stop this from working, just that being dirty or misaligned. To remove this end housing, there's 2 nuts here and a washer underneath them. And you should desolder these first, because these wires are quite fragile and you don't want to be bending them back and forth. So desolder those. Then this end housing will come off. This bushing here, a few of them had some oxidization in there and they were seized on that bushing. In here, here's an assembled one. You can see the brushes. That's how that should have looked. I'd already taken the brushes out. After you get this far, there's two bolts that come out of here, and then the field magnet comes off. That leaves you with your armature, and they were all stuck in there too. It took a lot of work working them back and forth to get them out of that bushing right there. And then that's it. That's the main body right there. And this is the part that's going to be the greasiest, and you can soak that in whatever kind of cleaner you have. Even a chemical degreaser could help strip that. These were full of grease that was really dry. So you can go quite aggressively at cleaning these parts. Just don't use anything too strong on anything that has these insulators or the field magnets or the armature. You know, don't use anything too tough on that either, or acetone or something would damage it. Just do it on the metal parts. And that's how it comes apart. So now I'm going to show you how I put these together and the sequence that I use. I do the electric motor side first. That way it's all buttoned up and covered when you're working on the greasy side. And with this method you can even test the motor, the electric motor side, before you assemble this side, just to make sure it works before you go through the whole trouble of making it back into one big piece. You want to make sure your field magnet is in good shape. You don't want a bunch of rust or dirt in there bridging those plates. You want to make sure you still have two usable pigtails to solder back on there. They always have this little insulator on here, which I'm not even entirely sure of the purpose, because it doesn't come close to anything that it could ground on, but it's there, and put one on if you don't have one. You can also check continuity through these wires to make sure you don't have an open field winding. It should be about zero resistance on that. So you just place the field magnet on there. And you don't want to tighten the bolts right down. Leave them a tiny little bit loose, because you have to make an adjustment here. So there's quite a bit of float in that, you'll see. And if you just tighten it right down, the field magnet can end up dragging on the poles of the armature. So this is where you want to make sure your fiber disc is still in there, your fiber thrust washer, and place it in the bushing. And then what I do is I take a piece of paper and I use it as a shim. Just to help center that armature in the field magnet. Then that should just pull right out, and your armature should spin freely in there. That's really important, because if you put this whole thing together and it's dragging on there, your motor's either going to run really slow or not at all. Best not to manhandle this commutator too much with oily fingers. If you do, make sure you clean it afterwards. So that little fiber disc again, you got to keep an eye on it. It tends to fall off and end up on the floor. So next step, you want to put your brushes into your brush holder. And this is probably the trickiest part of this whole thing, is assembling these brushes together. And you can do this, you could put this cover on first and then tuck them in afterwards. But it's tricky to get the spring connected. So the way I'm going to show you worked the best for me. Put your 2 small anchors and your spring across. It's the part I was saying is tricky. So then what I did is I took a pair of tweezers and I bent them so that they would spread out, and I put a little hook on them so that when I put this in from behind, it'll open up those brush arms, because it needs to be spread far enough to fit over the commutator on the armature. And you may need a few tries at this because it is kind of tricky. So that spreads them apart for you. Sneak my brushes in there. So the brushes are tucked in place. And this is the point you could put new brushes in. You don't have to reuse stuff like I am. You want to have a little bit of grease in this end bushing, but not so much that it ends up on the brushes. So you want those arms centered in there when you put your armature in place. Then take your armature and set it inside here. I'm going to take this off camera so I can see. So there, now I have the armature in and the brushes in place. And here you can check to make sure that your brush arms aren't bent. If they are, they'll be running off of the edge of the commutator, and you can actually just tweak them a little bit and bend them. So now I have that in and my brushes are in and happy. I've got my fiber thrust washer in place, and you can just set that in there. Try to do it in the camera. And that's the easiest way I found to do this. Like I mentioned, I did tuck them in from the side, and then I hooked that spring on, but it's really hard to keep these in place while you're doing that. So it's possible, but it's a lot trickier. The proper height for this ground terminal here, you can see this one's bent up. The proper height, because I've done some measuring, and the simplest way to do it without measuring is just to make sure that it's the same height as this tab here. Because if it's sticking out too far, it's going to ground on the housing and it'll just stay on all the time. If it's too low, it won't make contact with the tab on your switch either. Something to note about this little tab here, looks a little bit like it's some sort of electrical connection, but it's not. It's just a tab that allows you to adjust the end play in the armature, because you want no play in the armature. You don't want it walking back and forth. 2 washers go on here. 2 regular nuts go on there. Okay, so now I have my brush housing and cover in place. And again, you want zero play back and forth of the armature. So you want to adjust that tab till you might have a couple thou in there. that would be fine. And then also this housing, you have to make sure it's centered properly too, because it doesn't take much if it's in one direction or the other for it to cause drag on the end of the armature. So you just want to make sure it turns freely in there when you're done. Just trying to cover all the possible things that could go wrong when you're putting this together. It is a little fussy. So now we're going to solder these wires on, and we're going to solder our pigtail on there as well, our power wire. So for your solder connections, you want them to be nice and clean, and you want to have the wires from the field winding wrapped around and just slightly crimped down onto the tabs. For your new power supply wire, so for length, it needs to be long enough that this lug with the tab on it can end up sitting right here, kind of wrapped like this, because it needs to go up and around, there we go, and avoid the screw when it comes down and attaches here. It needs to wrap around like this. Best thing to use is a soldering gun, something that puts out lots of heat. If you have a soldering iron that's really heavy duty, it might work, but you want these solders to be hot, and you want them to be quick, because you don't want to sit here with a soldering iron and damage this insulator. You don't want to sit there and melt it. And you know you got a good solder joint when it's shiny. If it's dull, it's a cold solder joint. And if you ever have trouble with your old soldering gun, a lot of times you go to use these and they won't heat up. They're usually oxidized inside here, and you can usually just tighten down these set screws or take them apart and clean that, and then it'll get really good and hot again. You can see I don't really have that wire hot yet. When the solder melts on the wire, you know you're good, and then it'll just wick right in there. So now that you're at this point, you can go ahead and test this motor. I don't have a power supply inside here because I'm inside my house. I went up to my car and I powered this up, and it runs nice. So now we can put the insulator on, and this is where you can decide if you're going to make one of these or buy one. Just going to push that on, and again you want it to situate like this. I'm pointing this out because I only had one out of all the motors that still had the insulator on it. It wasn't deteriorated. I made it fit snug enough that it pushes in there nice. So again, it fits down in here, goes in there. It's a little tricky. And also don't use a wire that's heavier. This is a 18 gauge wire. I think I used a 16 on the first one, and it was too thick. I had to replace it with the smaller one just because it wouldn't bend and fit inside these gaps. So that's how it's going to go right there. I'm going to put a bit of grease on this tab just so it can wick in there. I did grease the bushing too, but I think it's a good idea to have that there. Again, not so much that it's getting all over the place. And then, as I mentioned before, make sure this tab is just about the same height as this one. It's just a good rough setting. You could also just measure down from the housing to here and up from the housing to there. You want it high enough so that the tab on the ground switch hits here and ramps up onto it and kind of has some tension on there. So you feel a little bit of a pressure as you turn the switch, and you've got a good, nice, solid contact right there. Silicone grease on here to help it fit into the housing. And a little bit of grease on here is okay. Or you could even put silicone dielectric on there. Something actually, while I have this apart, you might have a switch that's really loose and just flops around and has no tension on it. So looking inside here, you can see that tab is supposed to have some spring to it and drop down into those detents there, so that you get a firm click. Because when you've got it on, if you've got an old vehicle, you might find that this slowly rattles and falls and drops off and turns off your wipers when you don't want it to. So I had one and I thought, well, it's been staked on here. Somebody's whacked that when they put it together and spread that onto there. So I got the idea that I could maybe give it another smack and tighten it up. So I set this on my vise and I took a bit of a tapered chisel and I tried to put a new line in it, and instead it just broke a chunk out. So I don't recommend trying to hit that. So at this point, the only way of repairing this is to grind this off and then carefully drill a hole in the center of that stud and put a very small screw in there. If you had some super amazing epoxy, I mean, there's some really good epoxies out there, and this was really clean. You might be able to epoxy that back on, but I don't know if I would trust it to work. So yeah, don't hit that thing. But what I did find is a way to tighten this up. I had one that was quite loose, and it might seem kind of like a funny idea, but I took some dental floss and used the wax dental floss because it's better, and I just wrapped it around. I took it and I wrapped 2 wraps around there, just enough to get underneath here and put some pressure that way on the tab. And that might seem kind of hokey, but I can't think of any other way to tighten that up without restaking that and causing a lot of extra trouble. But a wrap or 2 of dental floss around there, you can't see it. You wrap it tight around to the shaft, and it brought the switch back nice and tight. So yeah, that's just a little workaround for that. Again, routing this so it is not going to come in contact with the screw. And I get that wire and the insulator positioned The first couple of times I put the insulator in there first and then tried to get that wire in, and it was really hard to see in there. Just going to push it in there off camera. I can't see. So I got a good seal all the way around there, good fit. And a person could shape that a little more if they wanted to. But I think if somebody saw that in your vehicle, and I don't think they're going to notice that you made that yourself. So yeah, take a couple of attaching screws. Again, put a little bit of grease on them just so they don't rust into the threads. Now with the screws tightened up, you can put an ohmmeter on your terminals and just make sure your switch is working. As I mentioned before, it can be a little finicky getting this tab in just the right place, so easier to check it now. So that's our electric motor finished. Now we can get onto the greasy part. I take a Q-tip, grease the bushings, not so much that it can end up inside your nice clean electric motor. You just want enough in there that can sit inside the grooves that they have cut in these bushings. Your first piece is going to be the idler. And just enough grease on it to fit in that groove. It's designed to hold grease in there. Drop it in so it meshes against the armature gear. Then your eccentric, and it has a thrust washer that's supposed to be on there too. Some guy right here, just see it there. Enough grease on there to fit into that groove as well. Just work it into place there. Next, take your wiper arm shaft. I probably have some of the names wrong, but I'm just making them up as I go. And then that fits in there. Put some grease in the bushings. Take your link. You can drop it into there. And what stops this from falling off, I kind of wondered myself, is the housing. It's tight up against it so it can't walk itself out. Yeah, so now you can put a whole bunch of grease in there, and the reasoning I think they have, like normally you just want to put this together and lubricate these teeth, but I think their idea may be, because it's mounted and it's sitting there for ages, you know, the oil and grease is going to end up at the bottom of the housing, and then maybe these ones will end up dry. So I think they put enough in there that it can slurry around like a, you know, mixing a pancake batter or something, and keep those teeth all greased up. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing that they did. I'm going to put a bunch of grease in behind here and all around these teeth. Then for a seal, I don't have a seal. I could make one out of cork or rubber, but I'm going to use silicone. And, you know, I'd guess that's about 1.5 tablespoons of, maybe 2 tablespoons of grease total in there. But this is exactly how they had it, and I'm sure if you've taken one of these apart, you're going to find the same story, because all 6 of mine had this much grease in here. Feels a little weird putting this much in here, but so yeah, just about like that. Now with a little bit of silicone around the outside edge and all my mess of grease in there, I'll put that front cover on. And these holes, as I mentioned before, are countersunk, and there is a tapered nut that fits into them. And the reason they're important is because, at least from what I see, is they centralize this front housing in place and hold it from moving sideways or up and down. Because if you just had a straight hole with a flat washer and a nut on there, this being mounted like this is your mounting point for the motor, and the arm working back and forth, those holes would tend to oval out and these nuts would loosen off over time. So it's important to get those fit the correct way. And they're a little bit hard to grab. I got some cheap sockets here, and they just catch on those. You want a good socket that doesn't have a taper in it like this one here, because they're kind of shallow. But they just bite when you tighten them down. Like that. Then I just use a bit of brake clean to wipe off any excess silicone mess I got on there. Like that. So now we have our little gear drive all assembled in there, and our motor done. You can take your wiper arm shaft, put some grease on that. And it will fit through the back side. Like that, and it'll engage into the wiper arm. This guy here, it'll engage into the back of that. Rag. So another fun little tricky part here is getting this spring back in and getting the C-clip back on. I put a little bit of grease on this spring just because it is moving back and forth in there when you're engaging your wiper. And it fits down inside, drops right down inside the cover. So this retaining washer goes over top. What I do is I take my little C-clip and I grab it there good and tight, and this is the dangerous part because if you're squeezing it really hard it can shoot out and you lose the thing. So it's one of those things where it's a bit of trial and error. And that went on first try. A couple other ones took me a few tries. Yeah, so your lever on the back, your engagement lever, so I got that tightened in place. That's your park, obviously. That engages, you got a nice good solid click there, everything's working nice. Then you have your front support. There's a bushing in there that supports the wiper arm shaft. And this is likely different on Land Rovers. I don't know. I've looked at pictures and it looks like it's a different shape, but it has the same function. And I put some grease in that cavity too, again, where the spring lives and inside this bushing. I put a little bit of grease in there as well because you'll see in a second the screw nuts that go inside there, they're aluminum, and they can freeze in there, like they'll corrode into place. And for the gypsy, this Bakelite or plastic spacer, there should be 2 studs on here too, but the spacer goes on first, and then that goes up against the windscreen frame on the inside. That shoves through, and then you put your seal on the outside, and your wiper arm stop too would go here. So that's where you can put on your new seal, or you can be like me and just make one. And I put a little bit of silicone grease on there. To make these, I just cut a piece of bungee cord. I drilled these out to 5/16, and I drilled this hole out to 1/4, and then I chamfered it just a tiny bit with a burr, and it fits on there. It's on there nice, just snug. Not so much that it's going to cause a bunch of drag, but it's not going to let any water in either. And again, you know, doesn't look original, but you can't see it anyway. It's tucked in there. And that's it. That is the complete teardown and reassembly. Thank you for watching my Lucas FW2 wiper motor video.